Have you ever wondered why some individuals navigate the treacherous waters of human interaction with the effortless grace of a swan, while others, armed with piercing intellect and ferocious ambition, perpetually crash against the jagged rocks of resentment and isolation? The answer lies not in the cold, unfeeling mechanics of logic, nor in the forceful imposition of commanding will, but in a profound, almost mystical comprehension of the human heart. The journey into this labyrinth begins in the blood-stained, bullet-riddled streets of New York City during the sweltering spring of a bygone era. A manhunt of unprecedented, cinematic scale is underway. 150 heavily armed police officers lay siege to a top-floor apartment, their weapons trained on a single, desperate man, two-gun Crowley. This notorious criminal, a man who would ruthlessly murder a police officer merely for asking to see his license, is completely trapped. As the suffocating tear gas seeps into his sanctuary and the staccato rhythm of machine gun fire echoes through the concrete canyons of the city, Crowley sits bleeding, writing a frantic letter addressed to whom it may concern. One might naturally expect the final, desperate words of such a monster to be dripping with venom, a dark curse cast upon the society that relentlessly hunted him. Yet, the words inscribed in blood reveal a staggering, almost incomprehensible psychological paradox. He writes that beneath his coat beats a weary heart, but a kind one that would do nobody any harm. Minutes later, he is condemned to the electric chair at Sing Sing prison, where his final grievance is not a tearful confession of guilt, but a bewildered, agonizing complaint that he is being brutally punished merely for defending himself. The profound lesson excavated from the tragic, delusional mind of a condemned killer is the bedrock upon which the entire architecture of human influence is constructed, the absolute, unyielding futility of criticism. If a man whose hands are stained with the blood of innocents cannot find a singular ounce of blame within his own soul, how much less effective will harsh criticism be when directed at the ordinary individual standing across the office desk, the dining room table, or the factory floor? The human ego is an incredibly fragile construct, a desperate, shivering entity that will instantaneously build impenetrable fortresses of rationalization to deflect the piercing arrows of condemnation. Criticism is never a catalyst for positive change, it is a reckless declaration of psychological war. It forces the recipient into an aggressive defensive posture, compelling them to justify their actions while simultaneously igniting a slow-burning fire of resentment that can smolder destructively for decades. To master the delicate art of human relations, one must first completely bury the primal urge to condemn, replacing the heavy, blunt hammer of judgment with the delicate, surgical instrument of empathy and understanding. The narrative shifts abruptly from the grim confines of a death row cell to the blood-soaked, haunted battlefields of the American Civil War, specifically the harrowing aftermath of Gettysburg. The fate of a fractured, bleeding nation rests upon the weary shoulders of Abraham Lincoln. Confederate General Robert E. Lee is in desperate retreat, his shattered army trapped against the swollen, impassable, raging waters of the Potomac River. The heavens have opened, pouring rain down in sheets, mirroring the endless weeping of a torn country. Lincoln, sensing the absolute, triumphant finality of the moment, issues a direct, urgent, and unambiguous command to General George Meade: attack immediately, destroy Lee's trapped army, and end the horrific war once and for all. It is an order carrying the overwhelming weight of hundreds of thousands of lives and the future of a continent. Yet, Meade hesitates. He calls a cowardly council of war. He delays. He manufactures endless excuses, and he stands paralyzed as the floodwaters recede, allowing Lee to escape unharmed into the forgiving embrace of the South. Lincoln's agony is absolute and overwhelming. The grief that washes over him is not merely political frustration, it is a profound, soul-crushing despair. In the suffocating heat of his righteous anger, Lincoln sits at his heavy wooden desk and pens a letter to Meade, a letter vibrating with bitter disappointment and crushing, irrefutable reprimand. He writes that Meade's failure is a disaster of unparalleled magnitude, a disgraceful betrayal of the blood spilled on Pennsylvania soil. But the true, breathtaking climax of this historical tragedy is not found in the stinging words written on the page, but in the destiny of the paper itself. The letter is never signed. It is never folded into a sealed envelope. It is never sent. It is discovered, years after an assassin's bullet claimed his life, tucked quietly away among Lincoln's private, unseen papers. Why did the most powerful man in a torn nation withhold his entirely justified, righteous fury? The lesson derived from Lincoln's silent, agonizing restraint is a masterclass in emotional discipline and strategic, visionary empathy. Lincoln understood, in the crushing solitude of the presidency, that unleashing his wrath would not bring back the slaughtered dead, nor would it force Lee's sudden surrender. It would only serve to completely shatter the fragile morale of a general who had just survived the most horrific, deafening carnage ever witnessed on the continent. By plunging into Meade's terrifying reality, a reality composed of deafening cannon fire, shattered limbs, and rivers of blood, Lincoln recognized that the view from the blood-soaked hills of Gettysburg was vastly, fundamentally different from the quiet, detached, and safe perspective of the White House in Washington. To influence the future, one must absolutely conquer the desperate, emotional need to punish the past. The individual who seeks to seamlessly bind others to their ambitious cause must recognize that human beings are fundamentally not creatures of logic, but rather creatures of intense, volatile emotion, driven relentlessly by the twin engines of vanity and pride. To condemn is the easy province of the fool, to understand and forgive requires the supreme, unshakable character of a true leader. As the suffocating smoke of war clears, the journey travels to the roaring, blazing fires of the American Industrial Revolution, where the landscape is completely dominated by ruthless titans of steel, railroads, and high finance. Among them stands Andrew Carnegie, a man who miraculously ascended from the bleak, impoverished, unforgiving moors of Scotland to the glittering, unprecedented pinnacle of unimaginable global wealth. Carnegie's unparalleled genius did not lie in the molecular understanding of metallurgy, nor did it reside in the complex, cold mathematics of corporate finance. His mastery was exclusively found in the delicate, unseen psychological threads that bind human motivation. As a destitute, hungry child in Scotland, the young Carnegie stumbled upon a profound psychological truth while desperately attempting to care for a litter of newborn rabbits. He possessed absolutely no food for the ravenous creatures, but he possessed a brilliant, innate understanding of human vanity. He gathered the ragged neighborhood children and offered them a tantalizing proposition. Whoever brought enough dandelions and clover to feed the hungry rabbits would have the supreme honor of having a rabbit named entirely after them. The result was a miraculous, instantaneous, and joyous mobilization of free labor. Decades later, this exact same childhood revelation would forge the most powerful, unstoppable steel monopoly on earth. When Carnegie sought to sell massive quantities of steel rails to the formidable, wealthy Pennsylvania Railroad, he did not simply submit a lower financial bid or argue the superior tensile strength of his product like an ordinary merchant. Instead, he built a massive, state-of-the-art steel mill in Pittsburgh and brilliantly christened it the Edgar Thomson Steel Works, named directly and unapologetically after the powerful president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The financial result was predictable, inevitable, and brilliantly effective. When the railroad desperately needed steel rails, they did not purchase them from nameless, faceless competitors. They purchased them entirely from the very monument built to immortalize their president's name. The brilliant strategy deployed by the Scottish immigrant reveals the most potent, insatiable, and agonizing hunger hidden deep within the human psyche, beneath the biological, driving imperatives of food, sleep, and physical survival. There exists an agonizing, perpetual craving, the desperate desire to be important. This burning thirst for appreciation is the invisible, electrical current that drives the vast, sprawling machinery of all human endeavor. It is the invisible force that compels an uneducated, impoverished clerk to study complex law by the flickering, dying light of a candle, the force that drives freezing explorers to plant fragile flags on barren, frozen wastelands, and the force that pushes exhausted parents to boast endlessly about the mundane. ordinary achievements of their children. The profound lesson is absolutely clear and undeniable. The deepest, most foundational principle in human nature is the craving to be appreciated. Not the casual wish, not the passing hope, but the agonizing, bone-deep craving. The tragedy of ordinary human interaction is that this hunger is so remarkably rarely fed. People walk through life surrounded by starving souls, yet they selfishly hoard their praise as if it were precious, finite gold, aggressively dispensing instead the cheap, destructive, and abundant poison of criticism. The ultimate master of human relations intimately understands that sincere, unvarnished appreciation is the most powerful psychological alchemy known to mankind. It miraculously transforms exhausted, resentful workers into tireless innovators, turns bitter, lifelong rivals into devoted, protective allies, and weaves an unbreakable spell of loyalty that mountains of money simply cannot buy. Flattery, which is cheap, selfish, and utterly hollow, is instantly detected by the subconscious and rightly despised, but genuine, heartfelt appreciation, forged in the fires of true observation and delivered without any expectation of a selfish return, possesses the staggering power to alter the very trajectory of a person's life, echoing in their memory for decades until their dying breath. The exploration of this profound, life-altering philosophy demands a sudden shift from the towering, intimidating heights of global industry to the quiet, unassuming, and pure loyalty found in the simplest of earthly companions. The narrative introduces a creature that embodies the absolute highest principles of influence without ever uttering a single, comprehensible syllable, a small, overwhelmingly enthusiastic dog. While human beings engage in exhausting, convoluted, and often deceitful machinations to win the attention and favor of their peers, often resorting to boastful posturing or desperate displays of wealth and status, the dog operates on a completely different, infinitely superior psychological plane. The animal does not read complicated books on psychology, nor does it possess the cognitive capacity to strategize or manipulate. Yet, when its master approaches the heavy wooden gate after a long day, the dog does not wait passively to be noticed. It erupts into a spectacular frenzy of pure, unadulterated joy, its tail wagging with furious, blinding devotion, its entire physical being vibrating with the ecstatic, overwhelming thrill of the master's simple presence. The dog does not ask for borrowed money, expansive property, or professional favors. It offers the one rare commodity that is infinitely more valuable than any physical treasure ever mined from the earth: absolute, undivided, and joyous interest. The lesson derived from this humble canine companion completely dismantles the foundational, arrogant error of modern human networking. The average, struggling individual approaches the world with a severely self-centered lens, perpetually broadcasting their own desires, their own monumental achievements, and their own pressing needs into the void, desperately hoping to capture the fleeting admiration of others. They spend agonizing years attempting to force the indifferent world to be interested in them. Yet, the unassailable, gravity-like truth of human nature dictates that a person can effortlessly make more devoted friends in 2 short months by becoming genuinely, intensely interested in other people than they can in 2 exhausting years by trying to get other people interested in them. The human ego is universally and tragically self-absorbed. The average person is 1,000 times more concerned with their own mild, passing toothache than they are with the catastrophic famine that starves millions in a distant, unseen land. To completely break through this thick, impenetrable wall of human self-interest, one must willingly and joyfully surrender the spotlight. The individual who brilliantly projects a genuine, vibrant, and probing interest in the lives, hidden struggles, and secret passions of those around them becomes an irresistible, magnetic force. This is not a superficial, manipulative conversational tactic, but a profound, fundamental reorientation of the human soul. It absolutely requires the listener to view every single person they encounter as a fascinating, uncharted universe of experiences, entirely worthy of deep exploration and profound respect. When one gazes deeply into the eyes of another human being and silently communicates that their existence truly matters, that their unique stories hold immense weight, They effortlessly unlock the heaviest, most trusted and guarded doors of the human heart. Securing an allegiance that outlasts all hardship, the narrative glides seamlessly from the unbridled, wordless affection of a humble animal into the chaotic, unforgiving, and deeply cynical machinery of human commerce, seeking the exact physical manifestation of that same miraculous devotion, in the towering, shadow-draped canyons of Wall Street, where fortunes are violently made and ruthlessly destroyed within the span of a single heartbeat. There existed a man trapped in a self-imposed fortress of perpetual misery. He was a highly successful stockbroker by conventional financial standards, yet his internal existence was a barren, joyless wasteland. For almost 2 decades of a suffocating marriage, his household was a silent, frozen tundra, utterly devoid of warmth, where he rarely spoke a kind word and his face was permanently locked in a rigid, terrifying scowl of supreme dissatisfaction. His colleagues actively avoided his piercing, critical gaze. His subordinates trembled in his icy, imposing presence. He was a human island, entirely cut off from the vibrant, pulsating warmth of the cooperative world. Then, driven to the absolute precipice of despair by his own isolating misery, he embarked upon a radical, terrifying psychological experiment. He resolved to perform a physical act that felt entirely alien to his rigid musculature. He decided to genuinely, broadly, and consistently smile. The morning this desperate experiment commenced, the transformation was not a slow, gradual thawing, it was a sudden, seismic eruption of positive force, as he greeted his bewildered wife with a radiant, unprecedented smile. Her face registered absolute, stunned shock, rapidly followed by an overwhelming, brilliant dawn of unexpected, profound joy. Stepping out of his front door, he bestowed the same radiant, uncharacteristic warmth upon the weary elevator operator, the invisible doorman, and the anonymous, exhausted cashier at the subway booth. The reaction was nothing short of miraculous, an instantaneous, profound psychological alchemy that defied all cold logic. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere of hostility that had surrounded him for decades completely evaporated, instantly replaced by a rushing, invisible tide of cooperation and genuine goodwill. The clerks who once cowered in his presence now greeted him with eager, enthusiastic warmth. The complex, agonizing friction of his daily, high-stakes business transactions was miraculously lubricated by this simple, costless expression. His home, once a silent tomb of bitter resentment, blossomed into a sanctuary of vibrant, deeply felt companionship. His massive income soared even higher, but infinitely more importantly, the heavy, suffocating shroud of his own internal misery was permanently lifted, entirely banished by the sheer, undeniable power of a simple, genuine smile. The profound, underlying lesson extracted from the astonishing resurrection of this hardened, cynical broker is that the human face is not merely a biological canvas, but a powerful, incredibly loud broadcasting station, continuously transmitting the exact frequency of the soul to the surrounding world. A sincere, radiant smile is not a superficial, mechanical contraction of facial muscles, it is a profound, undeniable messenger of absolute goodwill. It completely bypasses the heavily guarded, rational defenses of the conscious mind and speaks directly, intimately to the primal, emotional core of the recipient, silently but deafeningly screaming that they are liked, that they bring happiness, and that their presence is genuinely celebrated. In a world desperately drowning in suspicion, burdened by heavy, soul-crushing labor, and clouded by endless, paralyzing anxieties, a genuine smile acts as a sudden, glorious burst of blazing sunlight piercing through a dense, suffocating fog. It completely disarms hostility and melts the thickest, most ancient ice of human indifference. The individual who masters the deliberate, generous projection of this warmth becomes an irresistible, magnetic force, effortlessly drawing allies, highly lucrative opportunities, and unyielding loyalty from every corner of the earth. It is an irrefutable, immutable law of emotional physics that one cannot remain violently angry or deeply resentful while looking directly into the eyes of a person who is radiating sincere, unadulterated joy. The smile is the ultimate, universally understood currency of human connection, a limitless, overflowing treasure that enriches the receiver beyond measure without ever, for a single moment, impoverishing the giver, proving definitively that the most powerful, life-altering actions often require absolutely no words at all. Yet, as the narrative ascends further into the complex, fiercely competitive stratosphere of human influence, it encounters individuals who have weaponized not just their expressions, but their incredibly disciplined, steel-trap memories, to conquer the very highest, most treacherous peaks of political and social power. The story turns its piercing gaze upon the astonishing, unprecedented ascent of a man born into crushing, inescapable poverty, a boy left fatherless at the tender, vulnerable age of 10, forced to toil brutally in the suffocating, blistering heat of a brickyard merely to stave off the gnawing, relentless ache of starvation. He possessed absolutely no formal, elite education, no aristocratic, wealthy lineage, and no hidden financial benefactors to pave his way. Yet, this humble, unlettered boy would eventually rise with terrifying momentum to orchestrate the most powerful, sprawling political campaigns in the history of the American Republic, placing presidents directly into the White House and dictating the sweeping course of a massive nation. His name was Jim Farley, and his secret, devastatingly effective weapon was not a profound mastery of complex economic theory or soaring, mesmerizing oratorical brilliance that captivated stadiums. His unmatched, staggering power resided entirely in his absolute, almost supernatural obsession with a single, fragile sequence of letters, the human name. Farley recognized, with the piercing, unclouded clarity of a psychological genius, that an individual's name is not merely a convenient, arbitrary label assigned at birth. It is the absolute, sacred core of their identity, the sweetest, most incredibly important, and most intoxicating sound in any spoken language. He meticulously cultivated a terrifyingly precise, encyclopedic memory, possessing the staggering, almost unbelievable ability to instantly recall the first names, the specific, mundane occupations, and the intricate, deeply personal family details of over 50,000 ordinary citizens scattered across the vast, sprawling expanse of the continent. When he encountered a humble, grease-stained mechanic, a weary, sun-beaten farmer, or a lowly, overlooked clerk years after a brief, passing, seemingly insignificant introduction, he did not offer a vague, patronizing, and utterly forgettable greeting. He addressed them by their precise, cherished name, instantly elevating them from the invisible, crushing, and silent anonymity of the masses into the glorious, shining, and deeply validating spotlight of profound, individualized recognition. The masterful, unprecedented political domination achieved by Jim Farley exposes a raw, incredibly sensitive nerve running deep within the collective human psyche, the desperate, agonizing, and universal hunger for immortality and profound significance. A person's name is the singular, fragile vessel that carries the absolute totality of their existence, their burning pride, their unique history, and their desperate, silent hope to be remembered in a vast, cold, and utterly indifferent universe. The lesson drawn from this extraordinary, monumental feat of memory is that remembering, honoring, and frequently utilizing a person's name is the most subtle, yet overwhelmingly powerful, compliment a human being can possibly bestow upon another living soul. It silently, but undeniably and forcefully, communicates that the individual is so uniquely valuable, so remarkably and deeply significant, that their very identity has been permanently, carefully etched into the memory of the speaker. Conversely, the careless, negligent forgetting or the clumsy, thoughtless, and rushed butchering of a name is a silent, devastating, and deeply insulting blow to the recipient's fragile, desperately insecure ego. It communicates a crushing, agonizing message of absolute insignificance, silently declaring that the person is utterly forgettable, a meaningless, entirely disposable speck of dust floating unseen in the void. The absolute master of human relations deeply understands that every massive, towering corporate empire, every sprawling, seemingly invincible political dynasty, and every intimate, unbreakable, and fiercely loyal friendship is fundamentally built upon the solid, unyielding, and incredibly powerful bedrock of individual, highly personalized recognition. To command the absolute loyalty of massive armies or to completely capture the affection of a single, guarded heart, one must fiercely, relentlessly dedicate themselves to the arduous, highly disciplined, and profoundly rewarding task of memorizing the sweetest sound on earth, treating every single introduction not as a fleeting, annoying formality, but as a sacred, permanently binding contract of mutual respect and enduring, powerful recognition. As the symphony of influence continues its relentless, mesmerizing, and highly intricate crescendo, it introduces an art form so remarkably rare, so profoundly unnatural to the selfish human ego, that its flawless execution is frequently, and entirely mistakenly, attributed to absolute, unparalleled intellectual genius. The scene gracefully unfolds within the opulent, glittering, and highly exclusive confines of a lavish, high society dinner party in the beating heart of New York, a chaotic, dazzling theater of vanity where wealthy, highly influential guests engage in a desperate, deafening, and relentless competition to broadcast their own monumental achievements, aggressive opinions, and fascinating, carefully rehearsed anecdotes. Amidst this suffocating, endless torrent of ego-driven, aggressively loud noise, one guest, the pure archetype of the master influencer, encounters a distinguished, highly esteemed, and incredibly passionate botanist. For hours, as the glittering, loud party swirls around them in a chaotic, dizzying blur of flashing diamonds and flowing champagne, the master does something utterly astonishing, completely breaking the established, cardinal, and aggressively enforced rules of social engagement. He does absolutely, fundamentally nothing. He does not eagerly, loudly interrupt to share his own brilliant, highly calculated insights. He does not aggressively, skillfully steer the conversation toward his own impressive, towering accomplishments. He does not anxiously, desperately wait for a fleeting, microscopic pause merely to inject his own loud, booming voice into the vast void. Instead, he surrenders himself entirely, completely, and without reservation to the botanist. He leans forward, his eyes locked in a gaze of rapt, burning, and unshakable fascination, absorbing the intricate, highly technical, and deeply passionate tales of exotic, dangerous carnivorous plants, the meticulous, exhausting, and highly precise cultivation of indoor gardens, and the thrilling, incredibly dangerous expeditions to remote, untamed, and entirely savage jungles. He sits completely paralyzed by genuine, absolute interest, offering only the occasional, encouraging murmur of profound, deep astonishment, utterly, entirely silencing his own desperately screaming, massive ego, when the lavish, exhausting party finally, inevitably concludes and the highly decorated guests begin to depart into the cold, dark night. The esteemed botanist passionately, eagerly seeks out the host of the party, delivering a lengthy, soaring, and deeply emotional, almost tearful eulogy praising the silent master. He declares, with absolute, unyielding, and completely unshakable conviction, that this man, who had barely uttered a single, complete, and coherent sentence throughout the entire, exhausting, hours-long evening, was unequivocally the most fascinating, brilliant, and deeply engaging conversationalist he had ever had the supreme, absolute privilege of encountering in his entire, lengthy, and highly distinguished life. The staggering, almost comical, and completely undeniable irony of the botanist's soaring, massive praise completely exposes the deepest, most tragic, and universally believed illusion of all human communication. The profound, undeniable, and absolute lesson extracted from this opulent, glittering dining room is that the vast, overwhelming majority of human beings do not desperately, truly seek brilliant, highly logical advice, incredibly clever, lightning-fast banter, or dazzling, awe-inspiring displays of massive intellectual supremacy. They desperately, agonizingly, and relentlessly seek a silent, entirely willing, and completely captive audience, The human soul is incredibly burdened by a heavy, crushing weight of unexpressed, highly volatile emotions, secret, terrifying fears, and burning, unacknowledged passions, all desperately screaming to be released into the warm light of true recognition. True, unbroken, and fiercely focused listening is not a passive, lazy, or accidental act of mere hearing. It is the highest, most exhausting, and most supremely generous form of active, deliberate psychological validation. It is a rare, precious, and incredibly powerful gift that acts as a profound, deep healing balm upon the bruised, battered, and constantly ignored ego of the speaker, by completely silencing the frantic, selfish, and aggressively loud clamor of one's own mind and deliberately creating a massive, highly safe, and entirely empty psychological space for another human being to completely unfold their hidden soul. The listener performs an act of supreme, unmatched emotional charity. The speaker, heavily intoxicated by the incredibly rare, overwhelming, and deeply satisfying sensation of being truly, deeply understood and entirely the absolute center of the universe, naturally, almost inevitably, projects their own intense, swelling feelings of brilliance, profound significance, and immense satisfaction directly onto the silent, completely motionless listener. The absolute master of influence profoundly understands that to become extraordinarily, universally, and deeply interesting, one must simply, entirely, and completely become interested. The path to the absolute, highly guarded center of a person's heart does not run through the mouth, through endless, flowing streams of clever, sharp, and highly practiced rhetoric. It runs directly, exclusively and powerfully through the ears, through the highly disciplined, profoundly generous, and incredibly powerful art of absolute, unwavering, and deeply focused silence. This profound, transformative, and entirely counterintuitive principle of redirecting focus entirely away from the self seamlessly, beautifully evolves into the next, highly aggressive, and meticulously calculated strategy of absolute influence, vividly, powerfully embodied by the explosive, larger-than-life, and completely unstoppable force of nature that was Theodore Roosevelt, whenever the massive, intimidating White House was preparing to host an important, highly influential guest, whether it was a rugged, hardened, and deeply cynical cowboy from the vast, unforgiving plains of the West, a refined, highly educated, and incredibly polite diplomat from a sprawling, ancient European empire, or a brilliant, highly eccentric, and intensely focused scientist pushing the absolute, distant boundaries of human knowledge. Roosevelt did not arrogantly, lazily rely upon his own immense, incredibly intimidating presidential authority, nor did he lazily, foolishly fall back upon his own vast, incredibly varied personal experiences to violently, aggressively force the direction of the conversation. Instead, he engaged in a secret, incredibly disciplined, and deeply, highly strategic ritual, late into the quiet, dark, and highly isolated hours of the night immediately preceding the crucial, highly anticipated meeting, while the rest of the sprawling, exhausted capital city surrendered completely to sleep. The President of the United States would sit completely alone, aggressively, ravenously consuming massive, incredibly dense volumes of complex literature entirely focused upon the singular, highly specific, and deeply obscure subject that he knew, with absolute, flawless certainty, his impending guest was intensely, fundamentally, and deeply passionate about. When the highly anticipated, incredibly crucial meeting finally occurred, the guest was completely, inevitably, and overwhelmingly, entirely disarmed. They found themselves not facing a cold, detached, and highly intimidating head of state who demanded absolute, unwavering subservience to the massive, incredibly complex affairs of the nation, but rather a profoundly, deeply kindred spirit, a man who miraculously, flawlessly spoke their unique, highly specialized, and deeply personal language with startling, breathtaking, and entirely perfect fluency and undeniable, burning, and highly infectious enthusiasm. Roosevelt effortlessly, entirely bypassed the thick, heavily armored, and ancient, towering walls of rigid protocol and deep suspicion, walking directly, completely unhindered, into the warm, welcoming, and completely unguarded living room of his guest's deeply guarded, highly sensitive heart. The incredible, strategic, and highly calculated brilliance of Theodore Roosevelt completely reveals the absolute, unyielding, and truly golden key that effortlessly, entirely unlocks the heaviest, most heavily fortified, and ancient doors of human resistance. The profound, undeniable, and entirely absolute lesson is that the royal, incredibly direct, and entirely unobstructed road to a person's absolute, unwavering affection, deep loyalty, and complete, total cooperation is to speak, with genuine, burning, and highly infectious enthusiasm, about the precise, highly specific things that they prize entirely above all else in the vast universe. The average, tragically ineffective, and entirely blind individual approaches every single, highly critical interaction completely, entirely backwards, aggressively attempting to violently, forcefully shove their own narrow, highly specific, and deeply selfish interests directly down the tightly closed, heavily guarded throat of their increasingly resentful, highly annoyed audience, fundamentally, entirely failing to realize that this highly aggressive tactic only serves to trigger immediate, deeply hostile, and completely permanent psychological resistance. The true, absolute, and completely unmatched master of influence, however, operates as a highly skilled, deeply empathetic, and entirely flawless psychological chameleon. They willingly, joyfully, and completely subordinate their own burning, massive ego, temporarily, completely burying their own intense, pressing, and highly urgent desires, in order to meticulously, carefully construct a powerful, unbreakable, and perfectly designed bridge of mutual, shared, and highly intense enthusiasm, by deliberately taking the immense, often highly exhausting, and completely unrecognized time to deeply understand, passionately appreciate, and fluently, perfectly articulate the unique, highly specific passions, secret, hidden hobbies, and defining, massive life goals of the other person. The influencer silently, but incredibly, overwhelmingly powerfully, communicates a message of profound, unmatched, and entirely overwhelming respect. This meticulously calculated, deeply empathetic, and highly strategic action completely, violently shatters the thick, ancient, and deeply rigid barriers of ordinary, highly transactional human interaction, successfully transforming cold, highly suspicious strangers into devoted, lifelong, and fanatically loyal allies who are instantly, overwhelmingly eager to rapidly return the incredible, rare, and deeply profound favor of genuine, focused, and deeply personalized attention, as the master rapidly gathers this massive, invisible army of devoted, highly loyal allies through the flawless, incredibly disciplined, and highly deliberate application of genuine smiles, remembered names, deep, profound listening, and perfectly aligned, intensely shared interests. They inevitably, unavoidably encounter the absolute, most dangerous, highly explosive, and universally destructive trap deeply hidden within the entire, massive and highly complex landscape of human communication, the violent, purely ego-driven, and completely, utterly pointless argument. The narrative abruptly thrusts the audience directly into the incredibly tense, highly awkward, and completely suffocating atmosphere of a formal, incredibly lavish, and highly exclusive banquet in London, an event specifically celebrating a highly successful, incredibly arrogant, and loudly, obnoxiously boastful man. During the course of the long, incredibly exhausting evening, this pompous, highly self-satisfied, and deeply insecure guest loudly, aggressively, and very publicly quotes a beautiful, ancient, and highly recognizable line of poetry, confidently, absolutely, and completely incorrectly attributing it directly to the Bible. The protagonist of the story, a highly educated, deeply knowledgeable, and incredibly precise man, instantly, vividly recognizes the blatant, highly embarrassing, and completely undeniable error. The beautiful, timeless quote is absolutely, undeniably from the brilliant, immortal works of William Shakespeare, driven by a burning, almost uncontrollable, and completely, utterly foolish desire to aggressively demonstrate his own vast, incredibly superior intellect, and to publicly, decisively, and violently correct the arrogant, incredibly annoying speaker. The protagonist immediately, loudly, and very aggressively interrupts the flow of the entire, massive banquet to strictly point out the blatant, highly embarrassing factual mistake. The speaker, whose fragile, massive, and highly inflated ego is now publicly, violently, and suddenly under direct, aggressive attack, instantly, fiercely, and very angrily digs in his heels, completely refusing to back down, desperately defending his entirely incorrect, entirely false position with increasing, terrifying, and completely irrational volume. The tension in the massive, opulent room suddenly thickens into a heavy, suffocating, and incredibly uncomfortable, toxic fog. The protagonist then quickly, desperately turns to his trusted, lifelong friend sitting quietly beside him, an absolute, undisputed, and universally recognized expert on the complex, beautiful works of Shakespeare, demanding that he publicly, loudly, and definitively settle the fierce, highly explosive, and incredibly loud dispute. The friend, possessing a deep, profound, and incredibly subtle mastery of human nature that far, entirely exceeds his vast, incredibly deep knowledge of ancient literature, gently, quietly, but very firmly kicks the protagonist sharply under the heavy, wooden table, looks directly, calmly, and serenely into his angry eyes, and loudly, clearly, and completely falsely declares that the pompous, highly aggressive speaker is absolutely, undeniably correct, and that the beautiful, timeless quote is indeed from the Bible. The absolute, sheer, and incredibly shocking shock of this blatant, highly deliberate, and completely public betrayal of undeniable factual truth serves as the incredibly powerful, deeply profound, and absolute foundation for the single, most crucial, incredibly vital, and universally applicable principle of conflict resolution ever completely devised. When the angry, bewildered protagonist later, desperately, and very angrily demands a complete, thorough, and highly logical explanation for this terrible, deeply embarrassing, and completely false submission, his wise, incredibly insightful friend delivers a devastating, completely world-altering, and profoundly undeniable truth. There was absolutely nothing, entirely nothing at all, to be gained by publicly, aggressively, and violently humiliating a man who had never, entirely never, asked for a factual opinion in the first place. The profound, undeniable, and absolute lesson is that the only true, completely effective, and absolutely guaranteed way to truly win any argument is to completely, entirely, and aggressively avoid it altogether. An argument is never, absolutely never, a rational, calm, and highly logical exchange of facts. It is a violent, highly emotional, and completely destructive battle of fragile, deeply insecure egos. Even if you completely, utterly, and absolutely demolish the other person's highly flawed logic with incredibly brilliant, completely irrefutable, and absolute facts, you have fundamentally, entirely, and absolutely lost. You have stripped them of their precious, incredibly vital dignity. You have deeply, permanently, and absolutely bruised their fragile, massive pride, and you have successfully, entirely, and absolutely transformed a neutral, completely harmless individual into a bitter, highly resentful, and completely permanent enemy. A man convinced entirely, absolutely, and completely against his own deep, burning, and emotional will remains fundamentally, completely, and absolutely of the same, exact, and entirely unchanged opinion. The absolute, undisputed master of human influence never, entirely never, engages in this foolish, completely destructive, and highly toxic blood sport. They deeply, profoundly, and absolutely understand that true, incredible, and massive power does not lie in aggressively, loudly, and violently proving others completely, entirely, and absolutely wrong, but in smoothly, incredibly gracefully, and completely flawlessly preserving their vital, deeply important pride, effortlessly, silently, and completely avoiding the massive, explosive, and highly destructive landmines of unnecessary, pointless, and deeply toxic conflict, but what inevitably, dramatically occurs when the absolute master of human influence is undeniably, factually, and glaringly at fault? The fragile, massive human ego's natural, primal, and incredibly powerful instinct is to fiercely, aggressively defend itself at all costs, to rapidly manufacture 1,000 desperate, highly illogical excuses, and to aggressively, loudly deflect the heavy, crushing burden of blame onto the cold, unforgiving, and deeply indifferent circumstances of the external world. The sprawling, intense narrative pivots sharply to a tense, potentially highly explosive, and incredibly dangerous encounter located deep within the vast, sprawling, and beautifully shadowed expanse of a massive city park, where a man and his small, highly energetic, and completely unleashed dog frequently, joyfully roam. The man intimately, perfectly knows that the strict, unforgiving, and highly absolute law of the sprawling metropolis strictly dictates that the dog must be securely muzzled and tightly leashed at all times. Yet he completely, stubbornly, and incredibly foolishly ignores the rigid mandate, blindly trusting the desolate, seemingly empty, and deeply quiet expanse of the ancient woods. One fateful, incredibly tense day, he walks directly, completely unawares, into the imposing, highly authoritative, and deeply intimidating path of a fiercely stern, massive, and highly decorated mounted police officer. The imposing officer, armed heavily with the heavy, unyielding, and absolute power of the strict law, severely, loudly reprimands the terrified man, issuing a stern, uncompromising, and incredibly dark warning that a second, entirely foolish offense will undoubtedly result in an immediate, harsh, and highly punitive appearance before a completely unforgiving, incredibly strict city judge, for a few short, highly anxious, and deeply stressful days. The terrified man strictly, carefully complies, but the small dog deeply, violently despises the heavy, restrictive muzzle, and the man's weak, internal resolve rapidly, completely weakens, leading directly to a disastrous, highly inevitable, and completely foolish repetition of the exact same illegal crime. Once again, incredibly unfortunately, they stumble directly, blindly into the terrifying, entirely unavoidable, and massive physical presence of the exact same stern, highly observant mounted police officer. The surrounding tension is incredibly thick, the impending, highly severe punishment completely, entirely absolute. However, instead of nervously, quietly waiting for the officer's righteous, booming, and highly justified wrath to rapidly, violently descend upon him, the man launches a brilliant, completely disarming, and incredibly shocking psychological preemptive strike. He does not offer a single, pathetic, or highly desperate excuse. He does not aggressively, foolishly argue the utter, complete harmlessness of his tiny, innocent dog. Instead, he rapidly, enthusiastically, and completely condemns himself with astonishing, incredible volume and deep, profound fervor. He loudly, vigorously declares his absolute, undeniable, and complete guilt, emphatically, intensely stating that he has completely, inexcusably, and terribly broken his strict, personal promise to the highly respected officer, and that there are absolutely, entirely no excuses whatsoever for his blatant, terrible, and highly disrespectful infraction. The resulting psychological phenomenon is nothing short of miraculous, an astonishing, incredibly profound, and deeply revealing complete reversal of basic human nature. The stern, highly authoritative, and deeply commanding officer, completely, instantly deprived of his highly anticipated, righteous, and deeply satisfying verbal battle, immediately, instinctively, and completely softens. His massive, swelling ego, originally fully prepared to violently, aggressively assert its towering dominance, is suddenly, completely, and overwhelmingly satisfied by the man's eager, absolute, and incredibly public submission. The authoritative officer, incredibly, paradoxically begins to aggressively, warmly defend the deeply apologetic man against his own harsh, highly critical self-condemnation, gently, kindly dismissing the strict, unyielding law as entirely unnecessary in this specific instance, softly petting the small, happy dog, and gracefully, warmly allowing them to walk away completely, entirely, and absolutely unscathed. The profound, absolute, and deeply transformative lesson extracted directly from this incredibly tense, highly dangerous encounter is the staggering, almost magical, and incredibly disarming power of rapid, enthusiastic, and completely absolute self-condemnation, when an individual fiercely, loudly, and aggressively claims all the heavy, crushing blame before the other party can utter a single, solitary syllable. They instantly, completely, and absolutely steal the other person's highly volatile psychological thunder. The angry opponent, left with absolutely nothing left to aggressively attack, is naturally, irresistibly, and completely compelled to rapidly adopt a generous, highly forgiving, and deeply magnanimous posture in order to successfully, completely assert their ultimate moral superiority. By eagerly, loudly saying all the incredibly derogatory, harsh, and deeply critical things about oneself that the other deeply angry person is desperately, furiously, and intensely thinking, one completely, entirely, and absolutely neutralizes their burning, fierce anger, miraculously transforming a highly explosive, deeply dangerous, and incredibly toxic confrontation into a calm, deeply respectful, highly peaceful, and incredibly cooperative exchange, as the immersive, deeply psychological journey delves incredibly deeper into the incredibly delicate, highly dangerous, and exceptionally complex art of changing human behavior without inflicting deep, permanent, and highly destructive offense. The sprawling narrative returns gracefully to the roaring, fiery, and completely deafening heart of the massive American steel empire, quietly observing the unparalleled, incredibly charismatic, and highly sophisticated leadership of the legendary Charles Schwab, walking briskly, highly observantly through the massive, deafening, and incredibly hot expanse of his sprawling, towering steel mill one quiet afternoon. Schwab suddenly, unexpectedly encounters a small group of hardened, exhausted, and deeply tough workers openly, blatantly, and incredibly disrespectfully smoking directly, visibly beneath a massive, incredibly clear, highly commanding, and completely unambiguous sign that boldly, strictly reads no smoking. The average, terribly ineffective, and highly ego-driven manager would have instantly, furiously, and aggressively pointed directly at the massive sign, aggressively, loudly, and deeply humiliatingly demanding to angrily know if the men were completely, utterly blind or intentionally, maliciously, and highly dangerously insubordinate. This highly aggressive, deeply humiliating, and utterly toxic approach would have instantly, inevitably generated burning, fierce, and incredibly deep resentment, severely, permanently poisoning the crucial, incredibly vital, and highly fragile relationship between the struggling labor force and the massive, wealthy management. Schwab, however, operating continuously on an infinitely higher, completely superior, and profoundly empathetic psychological plane, completely, entirely, and absolutely ignores the blazing, highly visible, and incredibly strict sign. Instead, he approaches the startled, highly anxious, and deeply terrified men with a warm, incredibly friendly, deeply sincere, and completely disarming smile. He reaches slowly, smoothly into his highly tailored, incredibly expensive pocket, generously, warmly hands each of the terrified, deeply shocked workers a highly expensive, incredibly premium, and deeply luxurious cigar, and gently, cheerfully, and incredibly softly remarks that he would be incredibly, deeply, and genuinely appreciative if they would kindly, gently enjoy the fine, expensive cigars outside on the open, safe grounds. The hardened men are absolutely, completely, and overwhelmingly astounded. They intimately, painfully, and undeniably know they have blatantly, terribly, and highly illegally broken a strict, highly important, and incredibly vital rule. Yet their powerful, incredibly wealthy, and highly intimidating boss has not uttered a single, solitary, or highly critical word of harsh, humiliating, or angry reprimand. Instead, he has treated them with profound, unimaginable, completely unexpected, and highly deeply moving dignity, subtly, incredibly gracefully, and highly indirectly pointing out their massive error while simultaneously, generously, and warmly showering them with a highly prized, unexpected, and deeply luxurious physical gift, the hardened men's burning, fierce, and incredibly deep loyalty and absolute, unwavering, and profound admiration for Schwab instantly, massively, and completely skyrockets into the absolute stratosphere. The undeniable, incredibly profound, and completely absolute lesson permanently etched here is the absolute, unyielding, and incredibly powerful supremacy of indirect, highly gentle, and profoundly respectful correction. The complex human ego is a highly sensitive, incredibly fragile, deeply insecure, and profoundly volatile instrument that violently, aggressively, and completely rebels against direct, harsh, incredibly loud, and deeply humiliating orders, by cleverly, incredibly subtly, and deeply gracefully calling quiet attention to a mistake entirely, absolutely indirectly, and by completely, flawlessly, and heavily preserving the other person's vital, deeply cherished, and incredibly fragile face. The absolute master of human influence miraculously, beautifully transforms a potentially highly toxic, deeply embarrassing, and incredibly destructive disciplinary action into a profound, incredibly powerful, deeply resonant moment of deep, lasting connection and fierce, unwavering, and completely absolute lifelong loyalty, to further, incredibly deeply manipulate the incredibly complex, highly resistant, and deeply stubborn machinery of the human mind. The epic, sweeping narrative shifts its intense, focused gaze rapidly back through the dusty, ancient, and highly revered corridors of deep time, landing softly in the sun-drenched, incredibly bustling, and highly intellectual streets of classical Athens, critically examining the brilliant, incredibly disruptive, profoundly effective, and entirely unmatched psychological methods of the legendary Socrates. This barefoot, brilliantly eccentric, and highly observant philosopher did not aggressively, loudly, or violently argue with his fierce, highly intellectual, and deeply stubborn opponents. He did not arrogantly, loudly tell them they were completely, entirely, and utterly factually wrong. Instead, he employed a highly calculated, deeply strategic, incredibly subtle, and profoundly psychological technique that remains absolutely, undeniably, and completely unmatched in the entire, vast history of the modern, highly advanced era. Socrates would deliberately, carefully, and highly strategically begin every single, highly contested, fiercely debated conversation by gently, quietly identifying the exact, highly specific, and entirely undeniable points of complete, total, and absolute mutual agreement. He would smoothly, incredibly intelligently ask a series of highly strategic, carefully constructed, deeply probing questions specifically, highly meticulously designed to effortlessly elicit a continuous, unbroken, and highly rhythmic chain of immediate, highly affirmative, and completely undeniable responses. Yes, his deeply stubborn opponent would naturally, inevitably, and completely concede. Yes, indeed, they would affirmatively, absolutely agree once again, with every single, tiny, highly affirmative, and completely positive utterance. The opponent's rigid, deeply defensive, highly hostile, and incredibly aggressive psychological posture would subtly, gradually, and completely relax, smoothly, irresistibly drawing them further, incredibly deeper, and entirely completely into a highly cooperative, deeply agreeable, and profoundly receptive psychological mindset. By the precise, incredible time Socrates finally, smoothly, and incredibly gracefully introduced his ultimate, highly controversial, and deeply profound conclusion, the opponent, having already firmly, entirely established a massive, incredibly strong, deeply ingrained pattern of continuous, unbroken, and highly repetitive agreement, would suddenly, incredibly find themselves naturally, inevitably, and completely agreeing to a profound, entirely new, and completely transformative reality that they would have violently, aggressively, and completely rejected just a few short, highly volatile moments before. The absolute, profound, deeply psychological, and incredibly powerful truth underlying the legendary Socratic method is the incredible, undeniable, and completely absolute power of psychological momentum. When a complex human being vocally, forcefully, and aggressively declares the absolute word no, their entire, highly complex, incredibly delicate neuromuscular system immediately, completely, and entirely physically locks into a rigid, highly defensive, incredibly hostile, and profoundly resistant state of absolute, total rejection. Conversely, when a deeply stubborn person is gently, skillfully, completely gracefully guided to continuously, repeatedly, and highly rhythmically say yes, their entire psychological, emotional, and physical being miraculously, completely, and beautifully opens up, instantly becoming highly receptive, deeply cooperative, incredibly agreeable, and entirely vulnerable to profound, lasting, and completely absolute persuasion. The true, entirely masterful, deeply skilled influencer never, absolutely never, begins a crucial, highly delicate, and incredibly important negotiation by aggressively, loudly highlighting massive, glaring, and deeply divisive differences. They meticulously, patiently, deeply strategically, and highly carefully pave an incredibly smooth, deeply inviting, completely irresistible, and entirely golden psychological road paved entirely, exclusively with continuous, unbroken, and highly affirming agreement, effortlessly, silently, and completely leading the other person's highly complex mind directly, smoothly to the desired, highly beneficial, and deeply mutual destination without triggering a single, solitary, or incredibly minor rounds of toxic, destructive, and completely defensive resistance, as the immense, deeply psychological stakes reach the absolute, terrifying, highly explosive, and incredibly dangerous zenith of complex human conflict. The sprawling, intense narrative thrusts us directly, violently into the dark, incredibly bleak, highly hostile, and heavily blood-soaked coal fields of Colorado during the incredibly bitter, highly destructive, deeply terrifying, and famously vicious course of one of the absolute most violent, deeply terrifying, highly consequential, and incredibly massive labor strikes in the entire, vast, sprawling history of the rapid American Industrial Revolution. Thousands of desperate, incredibly starving, deeply exhausted, and fiercely angry, heavily armed miners are violently, aggressively, and completely relentlessly demanding higher, survivable wages. Their deep, burning, incredibly toxic fury terrifyingly, violently manifesting in massively destroyed company property and shattered, completely ruined, deeply tragic lives, standing directly, completely alone in the absolute, terrifying center of this massive, highly explosive, incredibly destructive, and deeply terrifying hurricane of pure, unadulterated, and fiercely burning human hatred is John D. Rockefeller Jr., the incredibly wealthy, deeply, universally despised, and highly powerful owner of the massive, highly profitable, and entirely paralyzed corporate minds. The entire, highly anxious, deeply terrified watching world completely, utterly expects the incredibly powerful Rockefeller to aggressively, forcefully, and violently crush the massive, terrifying, heavily armed rebellion with brutal, uncompromising, deeply ruthless, and highly violent corporate force, immediately answering their deep, burning, highly explosive hatred with cold, unyielding, deeply terrifying, and completely absolute power. Yet, Rockefeller masterfully, incredibly calmly executes a psychological, deeply strategic maneuver of such staggering, unbelievable, absolutely breathtaking, and entirely unmatched brilliance that it completely, entirely, and permanently alters the bloody, terrifying, deeply violent course of industrial history. He spends long, highly stressful weeks bravely, quietly, deeply humbly visiting the humble, deeply impoverished, highly dangerous homes of the violently angry, fiercely striking miners, genuinely, deeply, and completely silently listening to their heartbreaking, terrible, highly legitimate, and incredibly painful grievances without uttering a single, solitary, highly defensive, or incredibly angry word of harsh, aggressive, corporate defense, when he finally, bravely, highly visibly stands before the massive, heavily armed, fiercely hostile, and incredibly dangerous assembly of deeply striking workers. He does not arrogantly, loudly deliver a cold, highly corporate, intensely defensive, and completely unyielding ultimatum. Instead, he warmly, deeply genuinely addresses them with a warm, incredibly sincere, profoundly disarming and completely absolute vulnerability. He boldly, loudly declares, with deep, vibrating, entirely undeniable, and profoundly resonant emotion, that this specific, highly volatile day is the absolute, most important, deeply significant, and truly red-letter day of his entire, incredibly privileged, highly wealthy life, because he is finally, truly, and completely standing directly among his deeply valued, highly respected, profoundly cherished friends and incredibly indispensable, highly important, and deeply equal partners. He completely, entirely, and absolutely ignores the massive, highly destructive, deeply violent, and incredibly terrifying violence of the recent, terrible past, focusing entirely, absolutely, deeply exclusively, and with deep, burning, highly passionate sincerity upon their newly shared, highly cooperative, completely unified, and profoundly prosperous, incredibly bright mutual future. The staggering, completely unbelievable, absolutely breathtaking, and incredibly profound result of this massive, incredibly bold, highly dangerous psychological gamble is the immediate, almost magical, completely total, and highly peaceful cessation of the violent, highly destructive, entirely terrifying strike. The deeply angry, fiercely hostile, heavily armed miners, whose massive, burning, deeply bruised egos had been deeply, violently, and incredibly painfully bruised by long, terrible years of cold, indifferent, and highly ruthless corporate indifference, are instantly, completely, overwhelmingly, and entirely disarmed by Rockefeller's genuine, profound, incredibly warm, and highly public display of deep, absolute respect, profound understanding, and warm, undeniable, deeply heartfelt friendship. The immense, undeniable, completely absolute, and incredibly profound lesson extracted directly from this terrifying, highly explosive, deeply dangerous historical crucible is that fierce human hatred, no matter how incredibly deep, violently burning, or incredibly physically violent, can never, ever, under any circumstances, be conquered or entirely subdued by reciprocal, aggressive, violent hatred or cold, logical, deeply rigid, and highly defensive, arrogant arguments. It can only be completely, permanently, beautifully, and entirely dissolved by a massive, overwhelming, incredibly powerful, and highly sincere flood of genuine, warm, deeply empathetic, and completely absolute friendliness. The absolute, undisputed master of human influence deeply, profoundly, and completely understands that the fragile human heart is a heavily fortified, incredibly ancient, deeply fearful, and highly suspicious castle. You can never, entirely never, completely breach its thick, massive, highly defended walls with the violent, aggressive, incredibly loud battering ram of brutal force, cold logic, or highly destructive, deeply painful criticism. But you can effortlessly, completely, silently, and entirely unlock its heavy, iron, deeply rusted gates with the incredibly delicate, perfectly forged, deeply golden, and incredibly powerful key of genuine, sincere, profound, and absolute friendliness, the core message and profound, deeply resonant meaning that this monumental, incredibly influential book intends to completely, unequivocally convey to its vast, global audience of eager, highly ambitious readers is that the true, absolute, and completely unparalleled secret to massive, enduring, and deeply satisfying success in both the complex, highly competitive professional realm and the incredibly sensitive, deeply vulnerable personal sphere lies not in the ruthless, cold, and highly aggressive assertion of one's own massive, demanding ego, but in the complete, total, and incredibly empathetic subjugation of that very same ego in a profound, deeply respectful service of elevating, honoring, and completely validating the fragile, desperate, and deeply insecure egos of absolutely everyone else. It teaches, with absolute, undeniable, and perfectly crystal clear clarity, that human beings are fundamentally, entirely, and completely emotional, deeply irrational creatures desperately, agonizingly starving for genuine, profound appreciation, deep, authentic recognition, and absolute, unquestioned significance in a cold, vast, and highly indifferent universe, by deliberately, carefully, and incredibly strategically altering one's own deeply ingrained, highly selfish behaviors, by completely abandoning the highly toxic, deeply destructive habits of harsh, biting criticism, pointless, angry arguments, and cold, arrogant demands, and permanently replacing them with the incredibly powerful, universally resonant tools of warm, genuine smiles, deep, focused, and entirely silent listening, enthusiastic, absolute appreciation, and profound, unconditional respect. Any individual can miraculously, completely, and permanently transform the highly resistant, deeply suspicious world around them into a vast, incredibly cooperative, and intensely loyal network of deep, enduring, and highly prosperous relationships. The profound, ultimate meaning is that true, massive, and incredible power over others is never, absolutely never, forcefully, aggressively taken or violently demanded. It is always, completely, and entirely willingly, joyfully surrendered by a human heart that has been deeply, profoundly, and genuinely understood. The ultimate, undeniable conquest of the world is achieved entirely through the magnificent, completely selfless surrender of the ego,